Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. Today I have an assortment of terrifying encounters to share with you. Before we get into them, a couple links. As you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, and my merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. The links to Patreon and PayPal are in the description below. My merch is displayed directly under this video. Also, Dogman, Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeffrey Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, the links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support this channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe, click the like button, and please leave a comment. It really does help. And guys, it definitely matters. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's get on with today's upload, shall we? Today's first encounter. My daughter and I were driving home in rural Michigan's Upper Peninsula during the summer of 2018. We were almost home when we saw this strange being that was running faster than any animal I had ever seen. At first she said, "What is that?" Then she said, "It looks like a werewolf." I paused and said, "That may be a Dogman." It ran on all fours and had a very long body that was muscular. The face looked like that of a wolf in a way, but something about it looked human. It's hard to put into words. I kept my eyes on it its whole time. Its body seemed to be running in like glitches. It ran so fast, but it was also looking in our direction. My daughter was so freaked out by it. I was just kind of amazed and kept saying, "That's either a werewolf or a Dogman." I could see its teeth for a second, which were that of a wolf, but the face was half human and animal. It ran so amazingly fast, faster than I'd ever seen an animal run before. The darkness of its color was also kind of strange because it was such a deep black. Once it was past us, it disappeared. I never took my eyes off of it once. It just vanished. This is hard to put into words, what we saw and how it happened, but I'm telling you the truth. I'm 61 years old and my daughter is 41. I'm not sharing this for entertainment. I'm telling it because it's the truth. It was not the size of the dog because of its strange length of its body being so long compared to a normal dog. The face was bizarre, being half human and half wolf. I go by this area daily, and often when I'm with my daughter, I ask her if she believes in what we saw. She doesn't even like to talk about it amongst ourselves because she is still so freaked out about it. And there is no one who can actually say for certain, "Yeah, that's what you saw." My first thought was werewolf, but I've heard stories of other people in Michigan who have had strange experiences with what is called the Dogman, so I'll never know 100% what I saw. All I know is that it's something very strange and not normal. The reason I didn't have fear probably was because I was in a car. It was still very light outside when it ran across the road in front of us, although I do have to say later on I hoped it didn't follow us home. I think about this experience almost daily. The way it ran was so bizarre. It happened so fast, though I wish I could have captured a picture. My daughter is so spooked about it that she'll start shaking even talking about it. I believe there are lots of things out there that we just don't know about yet. Today's second encounter. A friend and I were hiking not far from downtown Salt Lake City in July of 2014. After a while, we decided to rest for a bit. It was around 5-ish. Since the trail was narrow and crowded with brush, we left the trail to rest under some tall fir trees, where the brush was less thick, but it was still shady. July in Salt Lake is close to 100 degrees. As I'm leaning on the stump, I notice that we're standing among several trees that formed a teepee shape. As we are noticing and discussing it, I heard a loud crash and then a twig snap a few yards in front of me. My back was to the trail, so I was facing a hillside and deeper forest growth, while my friend was facing the trail with his back toward the hillside. The trees in the teepee formation were to my right about 10 feet, and where my friend was facing them and the trail. So my head was turned about 90 degrees when I heard commotion coming from the base of the hillside. I immediately looked toward the sound and saw a hominid covered in dark brown fur moving quickly behind the brush. It wasn't more than 6 feet tall, and I didn't get a great look at its face because it had turned and moved so quickly. I noticed that its fur was two-toned, with darker hair on its shoulders and head, and lighter on its midriff. Its legs appeared darker. I shouted, "Did you see that?" to my friend, while trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The last time I saw someone tromping through the brush in the area was early spring. There were 2 cross-country skiers coming back down the mountain. One of them in the front was wearing a blue jacket with the typical two-tone dark gray shoulder pattern. For some reason, it was the first explanation that my brain came up with for what I was seeing there in July. I mean, I could clearly recall hairy creature, but at the same time my brain was refusing to believe it, and was trying to come up with some scenario for the situation. All I could muster was a skier hiking through the forest, not on the trail, but fully dressed in dark ski clothes from head to toe in July. At any rate, I then began to call out, "Hello, hey, hello," while also trying to listen for the direction of his retreat between my calls. My friend ran up to the spot where we had seen it to see if he could see anything. He had only seen a blur by the time he had turned all the way around to see what made the sound, so he wasn't sure what we were looking at or for, even though it was only a few short yards where I saw the skier. There was nothing there. I regained my short yards from the spot where we saw our skier, there was nothing there. I regained my senses and ran to see if there were any tracks. I found one, but it resembled more of a kind of a print that you would find in deep sand, more of a dugout-type depression in the needles. I measured it from side to side, and it was about an inch longer and wider on each side than a size 11 Chaco sandal I was wearing. I hadn't heard any crashing through the brush after the initial noise that grabbed my attention, so I was unable to determine what had happened to the skier after it had passed behind the brush. There were small green plants covering the ground in the direction that it went, but they were only compressed and then quickly ran out at the edge of the very small and gentle ravine running back up the hill. We scanned for tracks, but I didn't feel like pursuing it into the deep brush or up the ravine, so we went back to the trail. Oddly, neither of us felt threatened in the least, and although the valley we were hiking up was very narrow, we just continued up the trail in the same direction our furry friend had gone. We thought we heard movement up the hillside a few times and from various directions, but still never felt threatened. After an hour or so of high awareness hiking, we turned back so we wouldn't get caught up after sundown. After giving it some thought, I found it highly suspicious that the creature had absconded so quickly through the brush without any noise except for that initial crash. I wonder now if the noise was a deliberate attempt to get our attention, not as a trap, but rather as an alert, a sort of, "Hey, we're here, please respect our space." I'm never going to hike there alone again, that's for sure, but I'm definitely going back up there with a friend or two. I'd like to get a look at more indications of an individual or a family group. If a group has moved in, I'd like to know. Otherwise, I may assume that it was just a male just passing through. Today's third encounter. I grew up in southeast Texas, about 40 miles west of Houston, and lived on a small farm. Sometimes at night, there would be something screaming in our fields from time to time. My neighbors heard it as well. One morning, while waiting for the school bus at the end of the driveway, I looked down and noticed a very large barefoot print in the sand. The heel had been run over by my dad going to work, but the rest of it was plain as day. 12 inches long and 7 inches wide was still exposed that you could see. I knew it was a Sasquatch print. I wanted to show someone, but here comes the school bus, and I had no time to run back home and get my brother to take a look. That afternoon, when I got off the bus to see the track again, so many cars had went in and out of the driveway that day that it was completely gone. I was sure to be disappointed about that. I tried telling my brothers and a few friends, but they really never did believe me. There was a neighbor in the 70s who lived on the property directly north of ours. He went deer hunting, shot a deer and took it home, tied up the deer to field dress it, hanging it from a tree limb. His wife called him in for breakfast, and after he came out to the field dress the deer, he looked and saw the deer he had tied up was not there. He noticed it had been drug over a fence and into the woods, but he never saw what had did it. Everyone said it was a big cat that got it, but looking back now, I know that big cats pick up their prey with their teeth and walk forward. This deer had been drugged. Cats do not drag anything backwards. And how would a cougar be able to pull down a deer from a rope that was tied up with? If it was a cat that got the man's deer, the big cat would have been the last thing he saw going over the fence and into the woods, not the deer. Anyway, I was talking recently to a friend of mine who grew up next door to me. He is in his 50s now, and I'm in my mid-40s. He told me that he went fishing in the 90s on the lake that was on the property where the man had his deer drug off. He said while he was walking up to the lake in the woods that he saw trees that had bark stripped off about 9 feet off the ground and looked to be claw marks on the bark as well. While he was fishing there that day, he began to get the feeling like he was being watched. That made him feel nervous, but then he noticed a very strong, musky odor that he had never smelled before, and he got the heck out of there fast. He said when he goes to visit his parents' place, he can still smell that smell from time to time. He also said that he and his brothers would hear whistling and whoops on their property, but never saw anything. He said they also heard stuff walking on 2 feet in their property at night. Another incident in the same exact area in the 60s were some guys swimming at their lake one evening. It was about a half a mile from their house. Well, the 2 brothers had a couple of friends were swimming and their car horn started blowing. There were no houses close by. They thought that it was their uncle messing with them. They got kind of spooked because they couldn't see their car since it had become dark. So they got out of the lake and grabbed their flashlights and ran over to where the car was parked. They told me that there were very large footprints in the sand around the car. They knew then that this was not their uncle messing with them because the prints were so large. It would have had to have been some extremely large person who had left them. But nothing was ever said about Sasquatch. They just thought that it was a large man with no shoes on. One more thing happened to my older brother and cousin that makes me think as well that it was a Sasquatch. My mom had a twin sister and they were always doing stuff together. So one evening there was a special at church and my parents and aunt and uncle went. My older brother and cousin stayed at my aunt's house while the grown-ups were all at church. Long story short, my aunt and uncle had a cattle farm. And they had dogs that were kind of mean per se, but did not take to really liking people much. They always stayed outside. Now my aunt's place was 200 acres. Anyway, it was a large place, and while my brother and cousin were there watching TV or whatever, the dogs started whining outside. They had 7 or 8 of them. Now, these dogs never came inside of the house, but they were scratching at the door wanting in. Then they hear what sounded like scraping on the window screen of the living room. This was summertime and the windows were open. That scared my cousin and brother enough to lock themselves in the bathroom until the parents came home, all the way back from church. My brother said that he was in 10th grade at the time and my cousin would have been in 7th. My brother said it sounded just like something scraping its fingernails or claws on the window screens. It would do it to one window, but then go to the next and do that for a bit. He said whatever it was went around the entire house, scratching all the windows. I thought about these things off and on, that had happened to my brother, neighbors, cousins for a lot of years. And after putting 2 and 2 together, after some things I had experienced as an adult, I look back at these weird events back home, and now I believe it definitely was a Sasquatch that had done all these strange things back then. Today's fourth encounter. I live in southeastern Oklahoma, and this happened during a public land duck hunt about 7 years ago. I'm an avid outdoorsman from a young age, and this is unlike anything I've ever experienced before. I was hunting solo, and none of my buddies were able to join. I had hunted this spot countless times and knew the area very well. It was loaded with duck, so I decided to go in alone. I arrived at the slough plenty early, peppered the pond with decoy, brushed my blind, and sat down roughly 30 minutes before sunlight. The pond stretches 80 yards wide, 200 yards long at normal water level, and is located in a densely wooded creek bottom. The side I was sitting on faced the dense oak trees, which came nearly to the water. My rechargeable headlamp had been slowly dimming throughout the morning, so the batteries were losing juice. As I sat there, still calm in the dark, I heard faint footprints coming from the other side of the pond. It sounded very faint. Noise would have been produced by a doe or a stealthy raccoon. I flashed my light across the water and saw a pair of eyes light up. The height of these eyes were around 5 feet, about a foot taller than the reeds that were surrounding the pond. My assumption was there was a deer. No other wildlife in the area could possibly be that tall. I kept dimming the light, and I fixed upon it, and remained confident in my assumption that it was a deer. That is, until I saw the eyes move. I've seen deer in headlights a million times. I know how they move, and I know about their careful, meticulous maneuvers and mannerisms. This set of eyes moved to the left, but it did so in a very unique and eerie way. It never diverted its eyes away from me. They were entirely fixed across the pond, never once looking to watch its step over the shoulder. They felt like they were on me the entire time, not above me or aside of me, but directly at the source of my light beam. When the eyes moved, they did so in a rhythmic swaying motion. It would sway from left to right, sometimes pausing for several seconds and sometimes several minutes, and sway again by its head would move in a vertical position and then back to the horizontal position, finally coming back to its resting point a couple of feet from the last position. I also note that it never moved in a jarring manner, an unbroken stare and sway. With no abrupt movements, I probably watched this thing for 15 minutes. What frightened me the most is that they slowly rounded the pond in my direction, and my light was on it that way. After this thing had made it 30 yards or so, my light sputtered out. I sat extremely still, 12 gauge in hand, and prayed earnestly for the sun to come up. I was horrified and kept my eyes on its last known position. Ducks came soon, and I didn't shoot. I was too scared to move for a few minutes. I waited and decided to watch for this thing to move once I shot. I unloaded on some cupping ducks and saw nothing fleeing from the scene. No movement. I continued to watch for movement, although the morning, and never once saw or heard anything on that bank or in the woods. This thing had vanished without a trace. I looked for the tracks for an hour to no avail. It's not a crazy story, nothing grandiose. Looking back, what I remember from that morning was an overwhelming sense of being alone and an impending sense of dread as the eyes set upon me, slowly moving around the pond, getting closer. And in the 10 minutes between my light going out and the first ducks lighting up, I was petrified in my makeshift blind, trying to keep my breath to a minimum and listen intently for any church of leaves or twigs. However, once my light had gone out, I never heard or saw a thing. I've talked about this experience with others, and nobody could offer any explanation. Many suggest mountain lion, but I've watched videos and footages of their movements. This wasn't it. Sounds like a dogman walking quadruped to me. How about you guys? Tonight's final encounter. I had an experience in Yellowstone in 1990 while camping that scared me so badly I passed out from fear. My fiance and I were within Yellowstone's tent camping area. It was the end of September. Barely anyone was there. We chose an out-of-the-way campsite so that we did not have any campers nearby. We'd been driving all day and we were tired. We set up our tent, ate dinner, and went to sleep. Sometime at night, while my boyfriend was sound asleep, I was awakened by these enormous, crouching weight on my right arm and right shoulder. Whatever it was weighed a ton. I knew if I screamed or moved. If it was a bear, it was sitting on me and could easily claw through the tent material and kill me. It sat on me for hours while I was just staying there, not moving. Strange thing is, I never felt any movement from it, no twitching. I did not hear brush or anything else move. I did, however, feel it was warm after several hours of this. I got so panicked and scared that I passed out. The next day, there were no marks on the tent nor unusual tracks in the area. My right arm and shoulder were aching for days after. This was no dream, as I remember every single minute in sheer terror, and have thought about it ever since. I told my experience to a researcher, and he said it's typical behavior. He calls campers in tents sack lunches. I knew in my mind during that incident that whatever that thing was not normal. And it, however, very, very, very heavy and unmoving, like a huge vehicle pulling up and parked on me. Be careful when you wish for something. Don't wish for an encounter with one of these creatures. I've heard and read thousands of encounters over the years. Almost every person wishes they had seen one, as they now leave to readjust their mindset in so many new ways are uncomfortable to say the least. Just finding footprints and knowing it really can't be faked is quite an experience for sure. Alright guys, I had actually recorded the first 7 minutes of this at like 3 in the morning and then passed out in my chair. Just waking up, trying to finish this upload for you guys. I apologize, I am completely drained. May the Great Spirit watch over us all, and may He guide us down that path that we call life.